Several recent human rights reports reveal that under the Trump administration, Customs and Border Protection personnel have turned away asylum seekers who request protection at land border ports of entry in violation of the law. My amendment makes it clear that any CBP officer or agent who turns away an asylum seeker at the border in violation of the law shall be referred to the Office of Professional Responsibility and the DHS Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. As I mentioned, there are recent reports that indicate that this has been happening to numerous vulnerable asylum seekers requesting protection at U.S. ports of entry. In May of 2017, Human Rights First documented in their report, Crossing the Line, 125 incidents where asylum seekers were denied full access to the U.S. asylum process. And just this month, the American Immigration Council and others filed a class action lawsuit challenging CBP's continued practice of turning back asylum seekers requesting protection at ports of entry. Unfortunately, the anti-immigrant rhetoric that has been happening has seemed to embolden this CBP practice. In Texas, a CBP officer allegedly told an asylum seeker from Central America, "Trump says we don't have to let you in." And another one reportedly stated that Donald Trump just signed new laws saying that there's no asylum for anyone. We have heard repeated reports of CBP officers turning back asylum seekers, often using threats, intimidation, coercion, and verbal and physical abuse. We've also heard CBP turning away asylum seekers through verbal and physical abuse. CBP reportedly threw an asylum seeker's 6-year-old daughter to the ground, held a gun to the back of an asylum seeker and compelled her to leave the port of entry, and knocked a transgender asylum seeker to the floor and then stepped on her neck. Mr. Chairman, I seek unanimous consent to enter into the record a transcript of a recording of CBP agents turning away asylum seekers at the border. This bill is so severe in its entirety, and we've spoken about some of the pieces of it, and frankly, I'm really surprised that my colleagues on the other side are looking to completely change our asylum policy. But I wanted to give the story of a couple, we're going to call them Pedro and Magda, their names have been changed, who together with their 4 minor children and their nephew approached the Calexico point of entry in early June of 2017 to ask for asylum. They had fled their home, located in a more southern state of Mexico, after the cartel killed a close family member and threatened to kill the entire family. They presented themselves to the point of entry around 7 a.m. and tried to explain that they wished to seek protection in the United States. In addition to receiving other discriminatory and denigrating remarks on Pedro's appearance and the likelihood of their success on their asylum claim, they allege that a CBP officer threatened to separate the entire family from one another should they pursue their right to seek asylum. According to Magda, this agent claimed that Pedro would be sent to a detention center, that she would be sent to another, and that all 4 of her young children would be separated from her and one another. The officer allegedly posed the question, who knows how long they or you all will last, and intimated that perhaps 1 or more of the children would not be able to withstand the length of the proceedings. The officer also suggested that if one of the kids were to be deported, neither Pedro nor Magda would have any way of knowing. Terrified at this prospect of being separated and having the children brought to tears with fear over the agent's comments, the family eventually decided not to pursue their right to asylum and was officially deported to Mexico the same day. This is an untenable choice to provide, and if true, it would be a violation of our laws that CBP officers are not supposed to make judgments about the claims for asylum. That is simply not within their purview. They're not trained to do that. And we have laws around exactly what that process is and who conducts those credible fear interviews. Another story, Mr. Chairman, on February 16th, 2017, the Women's Refugee Commission accompanied Ana Maria, again her name has been changed, an asylum-seeking woman from Guatemala who had previously been turned away from the Hidalgo port of entry back to that port. 2 attorneys from the Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid also accompanied her. Once the group entered the Hidalgo port, WRC observed the interaction between Ana Maria and the TRLA attorneys who approached together and the CBP agent. The agent asked, "What can I do for you?" one of the TRLI attorneys explained that Ana Maria was seeking protection in the United States. In his response, the agent told Ana Maria that, quote, the policies have changed. The same TRLA attorney insisted that the officer process Ana Maria and refer her for a credible fear interview as required by law. The agent again responded that, quote, things are changing all the time, so it all depends. And he said that he would have to check. The attorney again insisted that Ana Maria had a right to seek asylum and that she should be processed in accordance with the law. The agent finally allowed for the group to pass into a waiting area off to the side, which had a door and was physically separated from the passport control lines. Now, this kind of behavior continues, and unless that Ana Maria if she had not had an attorney present who knew that she was required to have the right to present herself for a credible fear interview, and to have her asylum claim actually assessed by somebody who was trained and qualified, she would have been turned away, and that is happening all the time.
I think it's really important that we not get to the point where we don't take a position about the importance of honoring the faithful execution of the law and doing all that we can as members of Congress to ensure that that happens. Now, the second point that's been made is, well, there's really no evidence to support this. Well, I would point my colleagues again to a report done by Human Rights First, which has been introduced into the record, called Crossing the Line. As everyone knows, Human Rights First is a well-respected, independent advocacy organization focused on advancing human rights and civil rights here and around the world. They conclude in a very detailed report that this particular report is based on 125 cases of individuals and families wrongly denied access to U.S. asylum procedures at U.S. ports of entry. They conclude in this report, the United States is unlawfully turning away some asylum seekers at official ports of entry across the southern border without referring them as required under U.S. law and treaty commitments to asylum protection screenings or immigration proceedings. They go on to give examples that these individuals include an artist from Colombia fleeing political persecution at the hands of violent paramilitaries, a Turkish opposition political party member, a former Guatemalan police officer who resisted gangs, a Salvadorian child of Christian pastors who witnessed the gang murder of his sister, a Mexican fleeing police kidnapping after reporting cartel violence, Cubans requesting asylum, and transgender women from El Salvador, among others. They go on to say that asylum seekers were turned away by CPB agents have been kidnapped, raped, and robbed upon return to Mexico, and some face continued risk of persecution. So there's ample evidence that there's a problem here. You couple that with sworn complaints that were filed in the court proceedings, coupled with testimonials from individuals, and we clearly have a problem. And so all this amendment does is say the Department of Justice should investigate this. If they investigate these complaints and they find some of them are unfounded, no further action will be taken. But we should be making a very strong statement about our expectation that the men and women who serve in the Customs and Border Protection, and we acknowledge the vast majority of them, are professionals who discharge their duties with a strong commitment to the rule of law and to the prevailing statutes. But there are obviously some problems, particularly in the context of the rhetoric that has been used by some members of the administration, including the president, which have sort of invited this sort of treatment of asylee seekers. And so I urge my colleagues to recognize that this is a problem, to take the de minimis step of simply saying investigate this. We should have tremendous confidence that the United States can continue to maintain its position as a global leader by really honoring these great American values. And one of those most important values is that we are a country of laws, not of men and women, I guess. And that, in fact, we have a responsibility to abide by the laws that we enact, but also to honor our treaty obligations.
I, too, am privy to the Human Rights First report that was referenced by the gentleman from Rhode Island. Human Rights First, of course, is the successor organization to the Lawyers Committee for Human Rights, and they've collected a series of cases where people are actually being turned back at the border when they're trying to seek asylum. And let me just tell you about a few of the ones that are in this report, and I highly recommend it to everybody on the committee. One case is of Cuban asylum seekers who were denied access to the asylum system and told that, quote, the law has changed, you have to go back. Reports from January through April of this year indicate that CBP agents are turning away some Cuban asylum seekers. In January, agents at the Laredo port of entry told Cuban asylum seekers to go back to Mexico and wait until Trump took over to see if he was going to change the so-called wet foot, dry foot policy. Here's another one about a Mexican family that was threatened with jail if they continued to claim that they feared persecution by the Mexican government. This was in February of this year. The family fled to the Ped West port of entry to seek asylum after suffering violence and death threats from a major drug cartel. A CBP officer reportedly asked if they had any proof of the violence and if they had reported the incidents to the local police. A family member explained that the police were involved with the drug cartel, so they could not safely report the incidents to the police. The agent told the young man he was defaming the Mexican government, and if he continued to do so, the CBP agent would call Mexican authorities to have him put in jail. And just one other I'll mention, U.S. agents turned away Honduran family twice, forcing them to cross the Rio Grande. The eldest son was under threat from a criminal gang, so he sought asylum in the U.S. An immigration judge denied his case and he was deported. 2 weeks later, he was murdered by the gang. Fearing for their lives, the entire family fled. On their first attempt to seek asylum at the Hidalgo port, a CBP officer told them, you cannot be here, no Hondurans. If you don't leave, I will have to use force to remove you, and so on. Dozens and dozens of these cases. All that my amendment says is the GAO will give us a report about what is actually happening at the border. And so this does elevate it to a different level from a member of this committee or member of Congress simply writing a letter. And of course, we have heard from this administration at various points that they are not responding to letters from members of the minority party, that they are responding only to the chairs of committee. But in any event, I think that this pattern of activity that has been reported by very credible human rights groups and U.S. lawyers merits our inclusion in this legislation of a required report by the GAO. I hope that everybody can see fit to add this amendment. And with that, I will yield back, Mr. Chairman.